I want you to picture this. And I want you to really, truly put yourself in this exact scenario for a second. You did everything right.
Right.
You worked the grueling, long hours. You kept your vows when temptation offered itself. You paid the mortgage. You coached the Little League teams.
Yeah, you basically bit down on your own exhaustion year after year.
Exactly. So your family would never, ever feel the weight of the world you were carrying for them. You were the wall between them and the chaos outside.
Mm-hmm.
And then one morning, you wake up inside a nightmare, but it's a nightmare scripted by someone who has been, taking notes on your life for months.
Or maybe years.
Right. There is an ex parte order taped to a door that you once owned. Your bank accounts are frozen while you slept.
Yeah, it's instantaneous.
And your children have been abruptly reassigned from, people that you love into essentially instruments of a war that you didn't even start, a war you can't even locate on a map.
It is a devastating image to invoke. And what the author we're discussing today argues is that the true horror of that moment isn't just the event itself.
Wait, really? What could be worse than that?
Well, it's the reaction of the world around you. Because the people you turn to in that moment, your lawyer, your therapist, your friends, they all hand you explanations that are basically designed to pacify you.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
They tell you it's just, standard procedure. They ask you to explore your feelings about it. They gently wonder what you might have done to provoke it.
Right. Every single voice in your orbit asks you to look inward and, do the work when the violence is actually coming from outside, from this massive bureaucratic system.
Exactly.
Well, today that system is exactly what we're going to audit. But before we try to map this labyrinth, I want to ask you to please like and subscribe to this deep dive right now.
Yeah, it's really the only way we can keep bringing you these intense, unfiltered explorations.
For sure. Because today's mission is reviewing a highly requested, incredibly provocative new ebook. It's called Circumcision of the Soul, Divorce Rape as Rite of Passage by Conrad Riker.
It's a heavy one.
It really is. And I'll say up front, if you want to understand the history of our legal institutions before they were, according to the author, captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies, you should check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy this book right now.
Definitely. And you can also follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack and at Conrad Riker on Twitter for his ongoing legal strategies and psychological frameworks.
So our goal today is a forensic, unvarnished audit of the modern family court system, completely through Riker's lens. We're going to look closely at the history of these institutions, how they were built, and, his central argument that they act as a highly tuned extraction engine.
Yeah, it's a very mechanical look at things.
But before we take one more step, I need to make a crucial disclaimer. I'm speaking directly to you, the listener, right now. This source material contains highly politically charged perspectives.
Very charged.
To be absolutely clear, we are not taking sides, nor are we endorsing the viewpoints of the author.
Right. Our job today is strictly to unpack the ideas contained in the original source material impartially.
Exactly. We want you to understand exactly what this book is arguing, the architecture of its case, and why it's resonating so deeply with a specific demographic of men. We are just objective guides through some very volatile terrain.
That's vital context. We really have to separate ourselves from the emotional heat of the text to understand its mechanical arguments.
Yeah, let's start with the foundation. Riker says what happens in family court isn't just a quote-unquote failed marriage. I mean, people fail at relationships all the time without having their assets frozen by armed deputies.
Right, there's a very specific escalation.
So if this isn't just two people drifting apart, what exactly is the legal and procedural machinery that has been activated here? What is actually happening?
To answer that, Riker insists we have to basically strip away the therapeutic emotional language we're culturally conditioned to use. We have to look at the strict forensic definitions of the words.
Okay.
He begins by fundamentally redefining the word divorce as it operates in the modern era. Because historically, if we look at the etymology, the word descends from the Latin divortium.
Divortia.
Yeah, it literally means a turning away, like at the separation, a clean break between two parties who are just, no longer joined.
Which implies a sense of finality, right? We were a single unit, now we are two separate units, walk away, good luck.
Yes, finality is the key concept of divortium. But Riker argues that modern divorce is the precise inversion of that ancient concept. It is not a clean separation at all.
Yeah.
Now, he uses a very specific, pretty intense phrase to describe it. He calls it a parasitic tethering.
Parasitic tethering. I remember reading that phrase and actually wincing. It's incredibly visceral. What does he mean by that legally?
Well, he argues that the state doesn't actually dissolve the relationship and release both parties to go their separate ways.
Wait, they don't. I thought that was the whole point of a divorce decree.
That's the illusion, according to him. Instead, the state dissolves the covenant, meaning the mutual agreement, the trust, and specifically the husband's authority within his own household. But it preserves his material and financial duties indefinitely.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The man is stripped of his home, his accumulated savings, and his daily organic access to his children, but he is not granted freedom in return.
So what is he granted?
According to Riker's framework, the man is essentially indentured. He is conscripted into a permanent revenue arrangement governed by a court that now claims absolute jurisdiction over his future labor and earnings.
Which brings us to the subtitle of the book, which I know is going to make a lot of people listening instantly uncomfortable. Divorce rape.
Yeah, that's a tough phrase for a lot of people to read.
The immediate reaction is that this is just extreme hyperbole or deliberate provocation to sell books. But he spends a lot of time arguing that he is not using it emotionally.
No, he isn't using it for shock value, at least not solely. He actually defends the term using strict etymology again. The word rape derives from the Latin riper.
Riper, which means what?
It means to seize, to snatch, or to carry off by force. So Riker argues the term is definitional, not decorative. He uses divorce rape to describe the non-consensual, state-sanctioned seizure of a man's assets, his children, and his future labor.
And crucially, this seizure is executed under the coercive threat of armed enforcement, right?
Exactly. If you don't pay the newly assigned levy, men with guns will eventually come to put you in a cage.
Okay, let's unpack this timeline, because the seizure doesn't usually start with a polite letter in the mail saying, hey, please come to court in a month. The opening artillery, the thing that kicks the door down on this entire process, is the ex parte order.
Yes. Riker borrows surgical terminology here, calling the ex parte order the finish cut.
The finish cut.
Right. In law, an ex parte motion is one brought by one person in the absence of, and often completely without the knowledge of, the other party.
Wait, let me stop you because I want to make sure the listener really grasps how radical this is in the context of, well, Western law in general. Normally, if someone accuses me of something, I have the right to face my accuser, review the evidence, and mount a defense before any penalty is applied, right? I mean, that's basic due process.
Under normal civil or criminal procedure, absolutely yes. But family court operates very differently. An ex parte order can be granted without your presence.
You don't even have to be in the building.
You might be at work. There's no cross-examination. In many jurisdictions, there is no corroborating physical evidence required at all.
So what do they use?
A sworn declaration. Just a piece of paper where someone writes down that they feel threatened or afraid. And that is often sufficient for a judge to sign an order that immediately removes a man from his property and physically separates him from his children.
It sounds identical to a corporate hostile takeover. But instead of lawyers in expensive suits fighting over board seats in a glass conference room for months, the state uses an unverified piece of paper to instantly liquidate a man's entire life.
Before he's even been served, notice that he's being sued.
Right, before he even knows he's in a fight.
And the tactical brilliance of the ex parte order, from an adversarial legal perspective, is that it creates facts on the ground. This is what Riker emphasizes heavily.
What do you mean by facts on the ground?
Once a man is physically removed from his home and his access to his kids is severed, every subsequent court hearing, which might be weeks or even months away, unfolds against a brand new baseline.
Because the court isn't looking at the marriage as it was yesterday, it's looking at the status quo of today.
You've hit on the exact mechanism. The court generally doesn't try to restore the pre-separation reality. Its function basically becomes managing the post-separation reality.
So the damage is already locked in.
Exactly. The man enters the very first hearing already categorized as a displaced, supervised visitor. Riker writes that the finish cut doesn't adjudicate reality, it manufactures a new one instantly.
But how did we get here legally? Because, marriage wasn't always this fragile. Riker traces this back to a very specific historical shift, and ironically, it's not from a Marxist revolutionary, it's from an American conservative icon.
That is one of the most fascinating historical audits in the entire book. He points directly to the Family Law Act of 1969.
Which was California, right?
Right, it went into effect in 1970 in California, and it was signed by then Governor Ronald Reagan. This legislation essentially birthed no-fault divorce in the United States.
which fundamentally changed the definition of what a marriage contract actually was.
Severely. Prior to 1970, dissolving a marriage required proving fault.
Like adultery or something.
Adultery, extreme cruelty, abandonment, yeah. Marriage was viewed legally and socially as a binding covenant with mutual obligations. The state's role was to preserve that covenant unless a severe breach occurred.
So you couldn't just say, I'm not feeling fulfilled anymore, I want out, and I want half the house.
No, you absolutely could not. The Family Law Act replaced that concept of mutual obligation with unilateral exit rights,
Unilateral, so one-sided.
meaning one party could dissolve the bond at any time, for any reason, or honestly no reason at all, and still use the power of the state to enforce the division of assets.
Wow.
Riker argues this act shifted marriage from a permanent covenant to a mere revocable arrangement. It set the absolute foundational precedent for the extraction machine we see today.
Because it meant a contract could be broken by one party, but the penalties of the contract could be enforced against the other party who didn't want it broken.
Exactly, it's a completely asymmetrical contract.
Okay, I followed the legal history. You have this mechanism, the ex parte order, functioning as the hostile takeover tool, which was legally permitted by the historical shift to no-fault divorce. But a mechanism is just a dead tool, right? A hammer doesn't swing itself.
Right, it needs a user.
It needs a user, and it needs a system willing to enforce its use. If this legal machinery has been activated, how did the actual investigative bodies on the ground, the local police, the family court judges, the social workers, how did they become primed to almost universally view the man as the inherent threat in these situations?
This is where Riker moves from contract law into ideological capture. And he pinpoints a very specific origin point for this cultural shift. The Duluth model.
The Duluth model. I have heard this term referenced in passing in so many articles, but I really want to deeply break it down today. What actually is the Duluth model?
It's a framework created in the early 1980s by two activists, Ellen Pence and Michael Paymar, in Duluth, Minnesota.
Okay, hence the name.
Right. And Riker argues this was the precise moment the legal and law enforcement institutions of the West were fully captured by feminist ideology. The Duluth model started as a local initiative, but it rapidly became the dominant mandated protocol for domestic violence response across the entire Anglophone world.
And what's its core philosophy?
It operates on one core, unshakable axiom. All domestic violence is an extension of patriarchal male privilege.
Hold on. So it's not looking at individual psychological dynamics. It's not looking at, say, substance abuse or generational trauma or toxic relationship dynamics where two people just bring out the absolute worst in each other. It's strictly looking at systemic gender power.
Exclusively. It defines violence not as a loss of control, but as a deliberate, systematic enforcement of power and control by men over women.
Wow. That's a huge generalization to base legal protocols on.
From this axiom, Riker notes, everything else follows like a mathematical proof. If all violence is patriarchal control, then women, by definition, cannot be the primary perpetrators of patriarchal violence.
So what happens when a woman is clearly violent?
Under the model, if a woman appears violent, it must be coded by the system as reactive resistance. She's fighting back against patriarchy.
And what if a man is abused?
If a man claims to be a victim of a woman, his claim is conceptually impossible under the model's framework. He's either lying, or he is framing his own loss of patriarchal control as victimhood.
That is wild. I want to talk about this infographic he brings up in the book because this is where the rubber meets the road. The power and control wheel.
Yes, a power and control wheel is the visual centerpiece of the Duluth model. It's an infographic that Riker claims has colonized police protocols and court evaluator curricula globally.
So what's on it?
It lists various behaviors categorized as abuse. But Riker asks his readers to look very closely at the spoke of the wheel labeled using male privilege.
Right, and how does it define that? Because when I think of abuse, I think of, physical harm, screaming, locking someone in a room, things that are actually dangerous.
Well, the wheel defines using male privilege as making all the big decisions, acting like the master of the castle, and being the one to define men's and women's roles.
But wait, I have to push back on this. Making big decisions, defining roles, that doesn't sound like a description of criminal violence. That just sounds like traditional, historically normal household provision and leadership.
Right.
I mean, if a guy says, hey, we can't afford this vacation, I'm making the executive decision that we're saving the money instead, is that considered abuse?
Under a strict application of this grammar, yes, it can be framed as financial coercion. And that is Riker's exact point. He argues the definitions in the Duluth model are deliberately elastic.
Elastic so they can stretch to cover anything.
Exactly. They were designed to absorb conventional, traditional masculine behavior into the category of abuse. A man managing the household calendar, setting financial boundaries, or leading his family isn't exercising responsibility. Under this new lexicon, he is perpetrating coercive control.
So they basically criminalize being a traditional dad.
Riker claims this effectively pathologizes the traditional structure of the Western nuclear family, treating it as a criminal enterprise hiding in plain sight.
Let's talk about the real-world application of this. Riker uses the term gamma bias. How does this ideology actually play out when a man and a woman are standing in front of a judge?
Gamma bias is a concept describing the asymmetry of moral optics in our culture. It's the sociological observation that female distress is immediately granted high visibility and institutional sympathy.
Okay, makes sense. We're wired to protect women.
Right. When a woman expresses distress, it's treated as hard data, it is treated as evidence of harm. Meanwhile, male distress is systematically ignored, or worse, heavily pathologized. It is treated as danger.
So if a woman is crying in court, the system mobilizes to protect her because she is clearly a victim. But if a man displays anger or profound weeping grief because his entire life, his kids, his home, his savings has just been liquidated by a stroke of the pen, the system doesn't see a victim, it mobilizes to diagnose him as an unstable threat.
That is exactly the dynamic. And Riker points out a terrifying reality regarding how this model became entrenched in the first place. He highlights that Ellen Pence didn't arrive at the Duluth model through empirical blind research. She arrived at it through political conviction.
What do you mean by that? Were there competing models at the time?
Yes. At the exact same time in the 80s, family researchers like Murray Strauss and Richard Gels were producing rigorous, peer-reviewed data using what they call the conflict tactics scale.
And what did their data show?
Their data repeatedly showed that women initiate intimate partner violence at roughly equal rates to men, often in a bidirectional manner.
Bidirectional, meaning both partners are mutually combative.
Exactly. Both are hitting, both are yelling.
And how did the creators of the Duluth model handle that data? Did they adjust their theory to fit the science?
They rejected the data completely. Pence and her colleagues explicitly chose to privilege feminist political analysis over empirical scientific evidence. They argued the data lacked the quote-unquote context of patriarchy.
Unbelievable.
The result, Riker argues, is that law enforcement was transformed from a body of impartial investigators looking for facts into executors of a liturgy. They now operate on a theology where men are predecidedly guilty by virtue of their biology.
So what does this all mean? Let me try to summarize this because it's maddening. If a man is in court presenting documented facts, we're talking printed bank statements, time-stamped text records, literal receipts proving he didn't do what he's accused of.
The mirror, essentially.
Right, his proof. And the system is operating on this therapeutic Duluth-inspired dialect where a woman's, quote, lived experience reigns supreme over empirical data. Isn't he essentially speaking a foreign language to the court?
He is. And that is what Riker calls the tragedy of the naive provider. This is the guy who has played by the rules his whole life. He thinks truth is his shield.
He thinks he's in a rational environment.
Exactly. He believes that if he just organizes his binders well enough, if he just calmly explains the timeline, justice will naturally prevail.
Because he thinks he's in a court of law.
Exactly. But Riker says he is actually in a tribunal of ideology. The system's grammar is immune to male facts.
Immune. Wow.
Your bank records showing you save money are interpreted as financial control. Your calm, stoic demeanor while she yells is viewed as cold, calculating sociopathy.
You can't win.
You can't. Your presentation of evidence is seen as litigation abuse or aggression. You arrive pre-suspected of manipulation, while the accuser arrives pre-baptized in truth.
Wow. Okay, so ideological capture explains the how. It explains how the courts interpret the data and why they default to believing the accuser. But I have a huge problem with stopping the analysis there. Ideology alone doesn't explain the sheer scale of the system.
No, it doesn't.
I mean, family court is a massive, sprawling, multi-billion-dollar apparatus. You don't build a machine that big just on feminist theory. To understand why it's so huge, we have to look at the financial engine driving it, right?
You've anticipated Riker's exact pivot. He moves from ideology to economics, focusing on what he calls the divorce industrial complex. He asks the foundational question of all audits, cui bono? Who profits from family rupture?
And he traces this back to 1996, the 1996 Welfare Reform Act, signed by Bill Clinton. He calls this the synthesis of the feminist left and the neoliberal right. Now, I have to challenge this. These two political factions absolutely hate each other. How does Riker argue that they collaborated to build the same machine?
It's a brilliant, if incredibly cynical, political analysis. According to Riker, you had two distinct political desires occurring simultaneously. The feminist left wanted to fundamentally dismantle the traditional patriarchal family and replace the father's provision with the state's largesse.
Basically freeing women from dependence on husbands.
Exactly.
Okay, I track that. And the right, what did they want?
The neoliberal right in the 90s was obsessed with balancing the federal budget, cutting taxes, and getting people off welfare. They wanted to transfer the staggering cost of child poverty from the public treasury to the private bank account of the nearest responsible male.
So they formed a marriage of convenience. The left gets state subsidized, fatherless homes, which align with their social goals, and the right gets the bill sent to the father instead of the taxpayer, which aligns with their fiscal goals.
That is the synthesis. And the mechanical bridge that unites these two desires into a functioning engine is Title 4VD of the Social Security Act.
Title 4V, what is that exactly?
This is the federal funding stream. Riker explains that under Title 4V, the state government receives administrative overhead and federal matching funds based on the volume of child support it successfully extracts from non-custodial parents.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Wait. I have to stop you there. I want to play devil's advocate because this is a massive claim. Are we genuinely supposed to believe that judges and mediators are sitting in their chambers, rubbing their hands together, looking at a spreadsheet of federal matching funds before they rule on a custody arrangement? I mean, that sounds like a pure conspiracy theory.
It sounds like a conspiracy theory if you frame it as conscious individual malice by a single judge. But Riker isn't arguing that Judge Smith is trying to get a direct kickback on a Tuesday afternoon. He's making a structural argument about institutional incentives.
Okay, so how does it work structurally?
Think about it like a hospital administration or a police department relying on ticket quotas. The individual cop might not get a bonus for writing a ticket, but the department's budget depends on it, which dictates the department's policies, training, and overall culture.
Okay, that makes sense. The system protects its food source.
Exactly. Let's look at the syllogism Riker presents. If a state family court system is funded by the federal government based on the volume and dollar amount of child support it extracts, then that system will structurally, organically oppose shared parenting.
Because shared parenting doesn't generate money.
Right. It will resist presumptions of 50-50 equal custody. Why? Because equal custody usually means no child support or significantly reduced child support. Every father removed from the home and labeled a non-custodial parent equals a support order.
And every support order equals a federal payment to sustain the state bureaucracy.
Exactly.
So the child is just the alibi.
In Riker's brutally stark terms, yes. The child is the alibi, the state keeps the vigorish. He calls it a circular destruction machine, dressed up in the therapeutic language of care.
God, that's dark.
It commodifies children, transforming them into leverage tools to be traded for monthly support payments, all to swell bureaucratic budgets.
But the public would never tolerate a system that just blatantly commodifies kids. To make this palatable to the voters, you need a villain. You need a bad guy to justify the extraction, which is where the deadbeat dad moral panic comes in.
Precisely. Riker argues the deadbeat dad narrative of the late 80s and 90s was a completely manufactured propaganda campaign. It was designed to provide moral cover for building this massive extraction engine.
And he backs this up with statistics that I had literally never heard before.
Yes, he points out a statistical reality that is almost entirely ignored by mainstream media. Custodial mothers default on their child support obligations at comparable, and in some studies, higher rates than non-custodial fathers.
Wait, really? Higher rates?
Yes. Yet there are no aggressive systemic enforcement actions against women. There are no driver's license suspensions, no passport revocations, no perp walks in the local news for defaulting mothers.
Because criminalizing a poor, struggling mother generates public sympathy and backlash. It looks bad. But criminalizing a supposedly selfish father generates revenue and justifies the existence of the bureaucracy.
Exactly. The system doesn't profit from family reconciliation. Peace is the absolute enemy of profit. A settled father who co-parents quietly is a lost customer.
Wow, a lost customer.
Yeah, a man locked in 3 years of contested litigation, desperately fighting to see his kids, is a highly reliable, recurring revenue stream for lawyers, mediators, court-appointed therapists, and the state itself.
Okay, so we've mapped the legal mechanism, the ex parte order. We've mapped the ideological capture, the Duluth model, and gamma bias. And we've mapped the financial engine, Title 4VD, and the divorce industrial complex.
It's a comprehensive trap.
It really is. But recognizing that the state profits from this extraction is only half the battle, because the state doesn't just randomly audit marriages out of nowhere. The other half is understanding the psychological warfare waged by the accuser that actually kicks this machinery into gear in the first place.
Right, this is where Riker transitions from macro-structural analysis to micro-psychological profiling. He looks deeply at the psychology of the accuser in these highly contested divorces, frequently noting the presence of borderline personality disorder, or BPD, traits.
He introduces this concept called inductive identification, and he leans heavily on the mechanism of psychological projection. Walk me through how projection actually works in the heat of a family court battle.
Psychological projection is a well-documented defense mechanism where a person subconsciously attributes their own unacceptable impulses, motives, or actions to someone else. It's basically a way of avoiding the shame or guilt of their own behavior.
Okay, so pointing the finger to hide your own stuff.
Exactly. Riker argues that in the crucible of divorce, if you formalize this projection on a legal document, it becomes indistinguishable from a signed confession.
A confession. I love that framing. Give me a realistic scenario of how that plays out in a mediation room.
Okay, say the accuser files an emergency motion claiming her husband is secretly hiding money and planning to drain their accounts. Riker advises the man to immediately audit every single joint account because she is almost certainly hiding or preparing to move money herself right at that moment.
Right. What about other accusations?
If she accuses him of alienating the children against her, she's currently coaching them to reject him. If she accuses him of being dangerously controlling, she is simultaneously filing a 30-page legal motion demanding the court control where he sleeps, how much he earns, who he can date, and when he is allowed to see his own children.
So she is using the absolute terrifying power of the state to totally control every aspect of his existence while crying to the judge that he is the controlling one.
Exactly. The accusation is not empirical evidence of his behavior. It is a projective X-ray of hers. She is externalizing her own psychological chaos, and the court, completely blinded by the gamma bias we discussed earlier, legally ratifies that projection as objective truth.
Reading this section, an analogy popped into my head, and then 2 pages later, Riker actually used it. It's the myth of Perseus and Medusa, the Gorgon.
It is the perfect metaphor for the psychological trap men fall into. In Greek mythology, if you look directly at the face of Medusa, you turn to stone. Riker compares looking directly at the Gorgon to a man trying to reason with his ex-wife's accusations.
Okay, so trying to argue back.
Right. Every time a man tries to face the accusations head-on, to present logical evidence against her feelings, to negotiate with a disordered, shifting narrative, he is paralyzed. He turns to stone inside her frame of reality.
Because you can't logic someone out of position they didn't logic themselves into, so how did Perseus defeat Medusa?
He didn't look at her. He used his polished bronze shield as a mirror. He looked at the reflection of reality, not the monster's face.
The mirror.
In Riker's framework, the mirror is your documentation, your forensic audit of reality that exists outside her emotional story. You cannot reason with the Gorgon. You can only reflect her accurately through data and act based on that reflection, not on her provocations.
This plays right into what he calls the Kafka trap. It is so tragic because it weaponizes the instinct of the well-socialized, good provider husband.
Yeah, the guy who just wants to fix it.
This is the guy who is raised to believe that communication solves everything. Use your words. So he sits down and he tries to talk, explain, and empathize his way out of the accusation. But the Kafka trap dictates that the very act of him trying to defend himself or showing perfectly natural anger at having his kids taken away is recorded by the court as proof of the very pathology he is accused of.
It's a closed loop of doom. To use another mythological parallel, it's like trying to present boarding passes and alibis to the ancient Furies. In Greek myth, the Furies don't pursue Orestes because they carefully weighed the evidence of his crime. They pursue him because they're the literal goddesses of vengeance. It is their ontological nature to hunt.
Right. The Furies don't care about your travel records. They only care about the smell of blood. And if you stand there trying to logically explain your itinerary, you're just making yourself a stationary target.
Precisely. The family court system feeds on that unguarded moment where a man's love, logic, and decency forget to protect themselves against pure pathology.
Which brings us to what I think is the deepest, most painful, and certainly the most controversial part of the book. And I want to spend real time here, because why is the man so fundamentally devastated by this?
It goes deep.
Yes, losing your house and your money is terrible. Anyone would hate that. Losing access to your kids is agonizing. But Riker argues the devastation goes deeper than the material loss. He argues it's an existential collapse because the man handed his soul over long before the court order was ever signed.
This is the philosophical and spiritual core of the text. It's the concept he titles soul circumcision. Riker views the divorce not merely as a legal or financial tragedy, but as a brutal forced initiation, a primitive rite of passage.
A rite of passage usually implies moving from one stage of maturity to another, leaving something behind. What exactly is dying in this process?
What is dying, or being circumcised away by the trauma, is the false self. It is the ego built entirely on external validation, the accommodating provider identity that naively believed if you just followed the rules would protect you.
The nice guy syndrome.
Right. The man who thought his intrinsic worth was entirely contingent on female approval and his utility as a financial engine.
He brings in Carl Jung here, looking at the 4 stages of the unconscious feminine in the male psyche. Let's unpack these, because it really explains the psychological setup to the disaster.
Jung mapped how men project their own inner feminine, their anima, which is their capacity for feeling, intuition, and relational depth, onto women in the external world. There are 4 developmental stages. First is Eve.
Representing the biological mother, providing basic physical comfort, nourishment, and order.
Yes. Second is Helen, the romanticized, sexualized ideal. This is the perfect woman whose love will magically rescue the man from his own inner emptiness.
Like Helen of Troy, a face that launches 1,000 ships.
Exactly. Third is Mary, representing moral purity and spiritual devotion. The virtuous woman whose goodness somehow certifies his own morality. And finally, the highest stage is Sophia, representing inner wisdom. At this stage, the man integrates the feminine as his own internal capacity for feeling and wisdom without needing to project it onto a woman at all.
And Riker's absolute hammer blow of a claim, the part that is going to make a lot of men listening very defensive, is that Western men are culturally arrested at the Helen stage.
Yes. He argues modern men never progress past romantic idealization. They outsource their entire emotional locus to women. They use women as emotional pacifiers.
Which makes them incredibly vulnerable.
Exactly. This is why Riker claims that the ex-wife didn't steal the man's emotional life. He voluntarily handed it to her. He transferred the center of his selfhood into her keeping, decade by decade, compliment by concession.
So the family court didn't emasculate him, it just performed an autopsy on a masculinity that was already dead. That is a brutal pill to swallow.
It really is.
But where does this come from? We didn't just wake up in 1950 and decide to worship women. It's not just a modern invention, is it?
No, and this is where Riker's historical lens is fascinating. He traces this cultural arrest back 8 centuries to the 12th century Provence troubadours. He points to the literal invention of courtly love.
Before that, marriage was pretty pragmatic.
Completely. Before this, marriage was largely about property, alliances, and survival. But the troubadours introduced this idea where knights dedicated their martial prowess to an idealized lady, often someone else's wife actually. Her favor was treated as divine grace. Her displeasure was eternal damnation. It elevated female approval to a cosmic, almost religious principle.
So by the time modern feminism arrived in the 20th century, it didn't need to invent the idea that female testimony is sacred. The culture had been primed for 800 years by romantic poetry and chivalry to worship at that exact altar.
Exactly. The Duluth model and the legal system just operationalized that ancient romantic veneration into procedural legal doctrine.
He compares 2 types of modern men who react to this realization, and I found this brilliant. He compares the cynical black pillar, the angry manosphere guy who hates women, and the desperate suitor, the guy buying flowers trying to win his abusive wife back. And Riker says they are actually the exact same guy. How is that possible? One professes to hate women, the other is begging for one.
Because both of them still have women as the absolute axis of their psychological universe. The desperate romantic worships at the altar of Helen, hoping she will save him. The bitter misogynist, the black pillar, has merely inverted the projection. He flipped Helen into Medusa.
Oh, wow.
He changed the altar from worship to cursing, but he hasn't left the church. He is still on his knees, his entire identity still completely defined by his reaction to women.
So if that's the trap, how does a man actually achieve freedom? How does he get out of the church?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it's through anima integration, reaching that Jungian Sophia stage. It means metabolizing your own capacity for feeling, for grief, for joy.
Doing the internal work yourself.
Right. When a man owns his own interior depth, he is no longer a psychic vacancy drawing in exploiters. He stops emitting that subconscious signal of neediness that attracts the borderline personality in the first place. The system can take his property, it can restrict his access to his kids, but it cannot find the sender of him because he took it back before the legal proceedings even began.
Okay, so let's say a man has achieved this.
Yeah.
He has integrated his psyche. He's survived what Riker calls the Jobian descent, sitting on the ash heap like Joe in the Bible, realizing the progressive friends telling him it's his own fault or just modern therapists charging $200 an hour to gaslight him. Once he survives that spiritual death, how does he actually fight back in the real world? Because you can't just philosophize your way out of a garnished paycheck.
Very true.
This brings us to the final strategic section of the book, the Sigma Forge.
Riker outlines the evolutionary stages of the post-divorce man navigating this system. You start as the Gamma. This is the victim stage. The man is bleeding out emotionally, desperately seeking validation from anyone who will listen, endlessly telling his war stories about his crazy ex-wife. He is completely externally referenced.
I think we all know a guy stuck in the Gamma stage. It's exhausting. But then, ideally, you move to Delta.
The Delta is functional. He complies with the court. He works his job. He pays his child support to the system. He doesn't self-destruct with alcohol. But his flaw is that he still fundamentally believes if he plays by the rules and is a good boy, the system will eventually reward him or leave him alone.
And what's wrong with that?
The tragedy of the Delta is trusting a machine explicitly designed to crush him.
Which leaves the final evolution, the Sigma.
The Sigma is sovereign. He's internally referenced. He sees the system for exactly what it is, an extraction engine, and he is no longer consumable by the machine.
Let's get incredibly practical here. What are the actual on-the-ground tactics of a Sigma?
The tactics are cold, highly disciplined, and deeply strategic. First is a communication strategy known as gray rock.
Meaning becoming as uninteresting and unresponsive as a gray rock in the yard.
Yes. Starving the accuser and the system of the emotional reaction they desperately need to generate conflict. Remember, conflict equals billable hours for lawyers and mediators. Gray rock stops the billing cycle. You communicate only regarding the logistics of the children in writing, without emotion, using as few words as possible.
And second,
Obsessive, meticulous documentation. Building a time-stamped parallel record of reality that exists outside the court's therapeutic narrative. You don't argue with her allegations, you simply produce the time-stamped geodata showing you were at work.
just the facts. And what about parenting?
Third is parallel parenting, rather than attempting cooperative co-parenting. You accept that your ex-spouse is disordered, you drop the fantasy of a friendly blended family, and you parent your children sovereignly during your time, insulating them from the chaos.
Let me make sure I'm putting all these pieces together. If the family court system expects the man to either spiral into gamma rage and generate billable hours, or just sit quietly as a delta and pay his taxes until he dies, becoming the Sigma is essentially starving the machine of its fuel, right?
That is the exact strategic goal. The system's leverage depends entirely on the assumption that a man's emotional life is located inside a woman, and that threatening his access to her or leveraging his love for his children or draining his money will produce compliance or profitable conflict.
So you take the leverage away.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Remove that assumption, integrate your own soul, document reality meticulously, and the machinery seizes up. There's nothing left for them to use as leverage.
But Riker doesn't just leave it at the individual level, which I appreciate. Surviving alone is great, but it doesn't change the culture. He proposes a macro solution. He calls it the parallel polis.
This is where he draws on Robert Putnam's famous sociological study, Bowling Alone. Putnam documented the collapse of civic association in America, the decline of social capital. But Riker emphasizes the specifically gendered dimension of this collapse.
The deliberate destruction of informal male spaces.
Yes. He points to the decline of fraternal organizations, the Masons, the Elks, the Knights of Columbus, the local union halls. Riker argues these weren't just places to drink beer and play cards, they were the informal infrastructure of masculine self-governance.
How so?
They pooled resources, offered mentorship to younger men, and crucially, they provided reputational capital.
Reputational capital, meaning if a man in a lodge was falsely accused of being a monster by an angry spouse, 50 men who had known him for a decade could stand up, pool their money for his defense, and publicly vouch for his character.
Precisely. But a modern man alone, a man atomized in a suburb with no deep male friendships, he has nothing but his own word. And in a courtroom governed by gamma bias, his word is scientifically worthless against a whisper of fear from his accuser.
So the state expanded into the vacuum left by these destroyed fraternal bonds. The state became the father, the judge, and the community.
Which is why Riker's ultimate call to action is the return to brotherhood. He calls for men to form private, decentralized associations, to pool capital, share legal intelligence, recommend ruthless attorneys, and build generational resilience entirely outside the progressive matrix.
Because the system doesn't fear the angry, isolated divorced man venting on a blog. It fears 3 disciplined divorced men who meet weekly, compare notes, audit their local judges, and quietly fund a competent attorney for a 4th man.
It is entirely about building parallel structures that the state cannot easily metabolize or shame into submission.
Wow. We have covered an incredible amount of ground today. We started with the brutal mechanics of the ex parte finish cut, moved into the ideological capture of the Duluth model, exposed the financial engine of Title 40D, dissected the psychological warfare of projection and the Kafka trap, explored the deep spiritual initiation of Jungian anima integration, and finally laid out the strategic resistance of the Sigma Forge.
It is a comprehensive and undeniably bleak architecture that Conrad Riker has mapped out. But it is an architecture ultimately designed for survival and eventually true sovereignty.
Which brings us to our final thought. As always, we like to leave you with something provocative to mull over that builds on today's deep dive, pushing the author's premise to its logical conclusion.
Here is the question to consider. If the modern state and the vast divorce industrial complex rely almost entirely on the financial extraction, the labor, and the emotional compliance of men, what happens to the broader macroeconomy when this system succeeds too well?
That's a great question.
What happens to birth rates, to the tax base, and to the stability of the state itself when an entire generation of men successfully pass through the Sigma Forge? What happens when they see the trap, fully detached from the family court system by refusing to marry, withdraw their economic productivity from the taxable grid as much as possible, and refuse to participate in the traditional social contract entirely?
Yeah, does the extraction machine eventually starve to death for lack of fuel?
That's the ultimate unknown.
That is a profound, almost apocalyptic question to leave you with. What happens when the fuel decides it no longer wants to burn? We want to remind you that this has been an objective exploration of a highly controversial text, and our aim has been to impartially unpack the source material so you can understand the arguments shaping this cultural moment. If you found this forensic breakdown valuable and want to dig into the primary source yourself, you need to go to Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks right now to buy Circumcision of the Soul.
Highly recommend checking it out.
And be sure to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack, as well as at Conrad Riker on Twitter, to observe his ongoing strategies in community building. And finally, please hit that like and subscribe button to support the show and ensure you never miss one of our deep dive explorations. Until next time.